Hey everyone, welcome. This is Tracy Christensen at the Washington State Transit Insurance Pool, and I wanted to welcome you to the Human Firewall Security Awareness webinar featuring Sean Hoare from Davis Wright Tremaine. This webinar is brought to you as part of our best practice in the technology environment. So we're going to jump right in here and let Sean get started.
Thanks, Tracy. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about information security and about how you can truly assist your information security colleagues in keeping your information more secure. I think it's important for you to understand my perspective and what informs my actions on a daily basis about the work I do in information security. I spent most of my adult life in the public sector as a cyber attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice. And in that role, I was a point of contact with the FBI, Secret Service, and then what became Homeland Security in responding to all sorts of system intrusions, whether they be nation-state actors coming in from Southeast Asia or sophisticated crime syndicates from Eastern Europe. We saw just about everything that could be thrown at us in the public sector, but we were also responding to system intrusions in the private sector. For the last 2 years, I've been with Davis Wright Tremaine anchoring their information security practice, and about half my practice involves working with businesses to increase their security posture, doing everything from incident response planning, facilitating technical testing on their systems called penetration testing, drafting information security policies and procedures, and doing a variety of things to help increase the security of their information. The other half of my practice is responding to data breaches. And that's where I've seen just about every exploit that can be thrown at an information system and at human beings. And you are truly the critical firewall to your information security. As much as your information security colleagues will do technically to try to create a secure, robust information security framework, the human being is the absolute critical link to everything being done in information security. And so we're going to talk about the exploits that are thrown at human beings because it's really social engineering is what I refer to as the human hack. As much as the bad guys try to exploit our technology, they're doing things ever more sophisticated on a daily basis to exploit human beings that allow them to get into our technology. One of the things we're seeing still as a big trend are data breaches. We've read about a number of major breaches in the last couple of years on the front page of major newspapers, and they're still happening. Sometimes we get desensitized to it because we've read so much about them, but we're still seeing exfiltration of data, sensitive data from systems. And these past 2 months, especially leading up to tax day, although it doesn't stop with April 15th or April 18th, we've seen tremendous exploits in the financial services industry. Database hacks, whether it's a dormant service account and bad guys coming in through that, and then identifying accounts that they can access and exfiltrating tax return information. We've also seen social engineering where somebody thinks they're actually dealing with their CFO or their CEO, and they're told to zip up the W-2 images because that's what they deal with on a daily basis, and they send them to whom they think are their CFO or their CEO, and unfortunately it ends up on the dark web. We're seeing that kind of stuff happen literally every single day. So we're talking about stuff that happens in real time. It's happening today. It's going to continue to happen tomorrow, and the bad guys are only going to get more sophisticated. With regard to data breaches, though, we're looking at literally access to tables of information inside information systems, and then the bad guys will take that information out, which is what we call the exfiltration of data, where they're extracting data and then using it outside the system for their own purposes, typically monetizing the data. We're also seeing where we have point-of-sale systems. Historically, they've been the more vulnerable systems, in part because they're in environments where we have service personnel trying to provide faster, more efficient service to individuals, and maybe like in the restaurant industry, even though we have it here with transit agencies, of course, when you're dealing with customers. But the key is you want to provide great, efficient service, and oftentimes that causes us to be less secure, meaning sometimes we'll have a point-of-sale system, and maybe we'll actually access the internet from that system. Well, as soon as we do that, it opens up that point-of-sale system for intrusion by the bad guys. And as a consequence, we've read about in the newspapers some substantial point-of-sale systems with large name-brand retailers who have been hacked because that sort of a connection has occurred when it shouldn't have. We've also seen a lot of data theft, just where maybe somebody's lost a flash drive, a laptop, or bad guys have kicked indoors in the middle of the night and stolen paper data. All that is still terribly dangerous, and in fact, I think sometimes the paper theft can be far more dangerous than the data theft in that it has an immediate consequence on a consumer. And so we're going to talk a bit about how you've really got to watch your physical security in addition to your digital security, because in the middle of the night, the bad guys, unfortunately, are driven by addiction, will kick in doors, cut out etched glass doors or windows, go in and steal hard copy files that may have consumer information that they can then go back to their hotel rooms that they're probably renting with fraudulently obtained credit cards and then mine that data. And I've oftentimes will have a client that have been affected, the victim of a burglary the night before, and within 24 to 48 hours, their customers have identified them as a common point of compromise because the bad guys have been out mining the data literally within hours of the burglary. We also have things called what I call data dams, and that's where bad guys will target certain enterprises to try to extort money or for some other purpose. And that's where they will literally use compromised computers, sometimes tens of thousands of them, and send data at a website, for instance, and send so much data that nobody can communicate inside or outside of the enterprise, and literally will take a server offline. And we're seeing now those attacks are, last year I dealt with a number of them where they were hitting systems with 300 to 400 gigabytes per second. And those of you who may not deal with information security issues on a regular basis, what that means is that's a lot of data. Oftentimes it's so much data that literally a server cannot function, and you'll be incapable of utilizing your email. And to the extent that you have voice over internet protocol systems, sometimes it will take those servers offline and not even able to utilize a telephone. The past few months, we've seen a couple attacks that are peaked out at 1,000 gigabytes per second, which is just, it would take some of the biggest tech-savvy systems completely offline, and they'll be unable to communicate or conduct commerce. And so when you're thinking about your own systems where you've got employees who have to communicate with one another, you have drivers who have to communicate with one another, and all of a sudden you lose your ability to digitally communicate, it can have catastrophic consequences. And so we're looking at that as well. Ransomware. You probably have heard about some of these what we call encryption attacks, where a few hospitals of late have been literally taken out of service because somebody has held their system ransom. Well, what happens is that's an aspect of social engineering where a bad guy will send an email that is crafted to you, and you think it's destined for you, and so you open it up. And it may be somebody who does a lot of reconnaissance, meaning they actually have surveilled electronically your system. They've surveilled you. They've visited your social networking accounts. They know what your interests are. And they know that perhaps maybe you've had a family victim who has a family member who's been a victim of cancer. And they've seen that you've contributed to some charitable causes dealing with cancer. Well, you're going to get a message tomorrow that indicates that you've probably been invited to a charitable auction dealing with cancer victims in 2 weeks. And there's a PDF that will advertise that charitable auction. You click on that PDF, and kabam, your system now is encrypted. All the networks share, everything that's attached to that computer is now encrypted, and then you'll get a message on your screen that indicates that if you pay a certain amount of Bitcoin, and one Bitcoin is worth about $400 today, so you can do the math on that, then you can get your system back. Now, one of the things about ransomware is that you say, really, how could that possibly happen? Well, that's one area where there actually is honor among thieves. They know that if they actually give you back your system when you pay the Bitcoin, that the next person that hears about it is probably going to pay them as well so they can get back their system. If they somehow failed on that promise, if you will, then their business model fails. Now their business model is worth over $1 billion on an annual basis based on the fraud that's been conducted through ransomware attacks this past year. We also know that ransomware has been so profitable that the bad guys are creating more than 5,000 variants of malicious code associated with ransomware on a daily basis. So that's more than 250,000 variants of malicious code targeting ransomware victims because it's been so successful. They know that's where the money is, and they're going to continue to exploit that. Another big trend we see are fraudulent money transfers. And you may have heard where somebody within a company has wire transferred out maybe $25,000, maybe $125,000 to someone, and it wasn't who they thought it was, and the money was lost into what we call the black hole. Well, oftentimes the bad guys do reconnaissance, and they will learn how to spoof an email address, and so you may receive an email from what appears to be your CFO instructing you to wire transfer a certain amount of money to a certain client account. and it appears to be done in the regular course of business, and it appears as though it's the CFO that would otherwise be sending you that message because the email domain looks to be the same. And then you go ahead and wire transfer the $25,000 to that client account, only to be told later that no one requested that transfer, at least your client didn't, and the money was lost to some criminals. It's happening every single day. Millions of dollars on a weekly basis are being lost in the financial services industry to fraudulent money transfers. And once again, the bad guys have recognized that that can be very, very profitable. And so I'm going to talk about measures you can take to defend against these social engineering attacks. And then, of course, what triggers a lot of this is malware, malicious software. That's the combination of the word that results, of course, in malware, but it's all over the place. It's pervasive. And again, the bad guys are targeting platforms that consumers are using, and so you're going to see more of it. Just as an example, the smartphone platform, the last Information Security Journal study I read about that is more than 250,000 variants of malware specifically targeting the smartphone platform to try to access the networks associated with users of the smartphones are being created on a quarterly basis. And last year indicated that 16 million Android phones had actually been absolutely compromised, so the bad guys had access to everything that the consumer had access to. I expect the problem is much worse than that, but what that indicates is that to the extent that you're using a digital device, and the bad guys know you're using a digital device, they're going to do everything they can to access it. And they're not going to just access yours, but they're going to access tens of thousands of other users, because that's how they're going to make their money. Another thing we've learned in recent years is that everybody's vulnerable. So although you've got some tremendous personnel you work with on a daily basis at your transit agency, and I've had the good fortune of working with them myself, and there are some awesome individuals you get to work with on a daily basis. Or even if you don't work with them on a daily basis, you don't see them, I know they're working behind the scenes to keep your information secure. But the reality is that the bad guys are targeting all your agencies as well as all other business sectors. There is no sector that's immune from this stuff. The bad guys are pervasive, they're well-resourced, they're disciplined, they're persistent, and they're going to go anywhere sensitive data may be stored, transmitted, or processed. So if you don't believe me that you guys are targets, there's just a couple transit agency data breaches in recent years, some that have hit major headlines. First Transit in Ohio has had a couple issues. This past year, malware was discovered on a server compromising employee information, including all the sensitive information, for a period of 4 years. They didn't realize until September of 2015 that bad guys had actually been in their network for 4 years, compromising literally every employee's sensitive information. Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Agency suffered a compromise this past year as well, affecting 785 individuals. Again, apparently it was a mechanical malfunction during a mail merge that unfortunately resulted in Social Security numbers and other information being sent to incorrect addresses. And while that wasn't a piece of malware or a bad guy that went into a system, nonetheless, it resulted in the unauthorized disclosure of very sensitive information and adversely affected almost 800 people. New York City Transit Authority suffered an information incident in 2014, and this is another incident of stuff that can go bad. Some information or hardware was being transitioned out of use, and unfortunately, a discarded CD inside a computer that was being transitioned out from use was later found by a third party and found to contain personal information of 15,000 individuals. BART has been hacked on multiple occasions. One of the most recent was in 2011, where almost 2,500 individuals had their information affected. First Transit, once again, a flash drive was lost, containing criminal histories, health information, Social Security numbers, and literally all the sensitive information of applicants for jobs. Central Ohio Transit Authority. Unfortunately, Social Security numbers of current and former employees were accidentally sent to health insurance companies proposing to bid. So all these types of things happen not on a daily basis, but they happen periodically. And it's a combination of hacks, it's a combination of mistakes, it's a combination of inadvertent data loss. But the bottom line is it all comes back to hurt employees and consumers, and we need to do everything we can to avoid that. I also just as a reminder of the trends we're seeing out there, the slide you're seeing in front of you right now are the most recently reported data breaches in the United States as of April 25th, 2016. This is just a snapshot of data breaches that were reported largely to the California Attorney General and other publicly reported repositories that ultimately show up on privacyrights.org, which is a website that tracks literally every reportable data breach since 2005. You'll see that this, as a snapshot, this covers a wide variety of business sectors. We're talking education, financial advisors, our financial services industry, telecommunications industry, medical industry, the hospitality industry, and even construction. And most of these, if you look at, are social engineering exploits, where bad guys persuaded an otherwise well-intentioned individual within a corporation to provide them W-2 information of their own employees. And typically this was where somebody received an email message that they thought was from one of their superiors requesting in the regular course of business a review of the W-2 information. And the person, typically in an accounting or human resources function, simply dutifully zipped up the W-2 information and provided it to the superior that he or she thought had requested it. And unfortunately, it was somebody in the dark web, and that W-2 information was then used to file false tax returns on behalf of, or in the names of, the actual consumers, or to otherwise start to monetize that data. And so that reinforces the fact that it's the human link that is the most critical link in the firewall for information security. One of the things the FBI has learned in the last couple of years, and they've actually created this graphic, is that there is this dark web comprised of individuals who become very sophisticated in marketing their wares to exploit systems. There are a variety of criminal forums, for instance, that serve as a marketplace for criminal activity. And the bad actors actually use the forum to buy and sell their products or services and create business associates and connections, build networks, and ultimately build their reputations based on the service they're able to provide to others who want to use their services. And with regard to those services, one of the major services is what we call bulletproof hosting. And these are where the bad guys in the dark web have corrupted the domain name registration conventions so that unless you're invited in and unless you know where to find the servers, you can't. So they're otherwise protected, which is why they host infected websites there, malware there, command and control stations for botnets there, and they otherwise host anonymization services and facilitate a variety of other aspects of criminal services on the dark web. Another thing is it's one thing to write malicious code, it's a whole other thing to monetize the code. And so monetization is the service that's provided. Bad guys get real sophisticated at that, and they can make some good money at that. There are a number of services necessary for the malware delivery process. Spam botnets, there are individuals who create those, who will send out phishing emails used to generate infections. There are pay-per-install and networks and traffic, all of which can be purchased. There are coding services, apart from the development of malware itself, required to customize the malware and tailor it for specific targets. And then one of the things I thought was ingenious at the outset, but now it's just old hat, is that the bad guys also have their own antivirus checking services. And so they're able to run malicious code through the largest proprietary libraries containing antivirus signatures to determine whether or not that virus is actually going to be successfully injected into a system without detection. And if it actually is able to fly under the radar, if you will, of the antivirus checking system of the bad guys in the dark web, then they know that they can tunnel into a corporation and not be detected for months or perhaps years. I personally have worked on cases where the malware was not able to be detected for anywhere from 8 to 14 months because it hadn't yet been identified and been placed in a proprietary AV signature library. And so when you think, oftentimes we'll read in the paper about how a system had been infected, and for whatever reason they didn't detect it for months and sometimes longer than that. Well, and we say, oh gosh, how could they have done that? Well, the reality is that if in fact you've got 5,000 new variants of just the ransomware malicious code being generated on a daily basis, the proprietary antivirus signature libraries, and those are those that you purchase as a service or sometimes are freeware that you install on your systems. They're legitimate systems, and those will pick up the malicious code. But the malicious code now is being generated so rapidly that those proprietary libraries simply cannot identify them. And typically, unless they're identified as responsible through forensics investigation of a data hack, only then are they actually put in those proprietary libraries. So sometimes they will go for literally months, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14 months before they're identified as malicious code, which is why many systems are infected today, and nobody has the ability yet to identify that they're actually infected until at some point anomalous patterns of data will show up and data will be exfiltrated from a system, causing an information security professional to recognize that something is happening internally, and once they review the file logs, will understand that, oh, there was a piece of malware in the system that prior to that time was unable to be detected, and at some point they then pull it out and then put it in what we call a sandbox and analyze it, and it becomes part of a library that will help others. But the bottom line is there are all these services in the dark web. The bad guys have learned how to monetize those services, and so you can buy literally everything you need to hack into a system or send out spam, botnets, and you can make some serious money on it. So my message today is that the threat's real. There are database hacks, point-of-sale system hacks. There are extortionate hacks in both encryption, ransomware, and distributed denial of service. And with regard to extortionate hacks, one of the reasons I think they're so dangerous right now is that I've seen a combination of those hacks hit certain businesses. For instance, I've seen a business hit with an encryption attack on one occasion, and where they thought they had a pretty robust information security system, and they were able to wipe the devices that were affected by it and upload backup data from their functional backup systems. The bad guys got upset and hit them with a denial of service attack, trying to take them offline, showing that if you're not going to pay me one way, we're going to cause you to pay us another way. Social engineering as well is getting ever more sophisticated, and it's very, very hard as an employee to detect a fraudulent message when it appears to be coming from your boss. And oftentimes, as a dutiful employee, you want to respond efficiently and effectively to your boss. And so oftentimes the bad guys will do some reconnaissance. Sometimes they'll actually get a feel for what your network is comprised of, who works in different departments, and then they will send a properly crafted message, and the W-2 stuff goes out the back door. And fraudulent money transfer exploits, they're very real. Mobile device data theft, burglaries, hard copy data theft. As I mentioned, these are all very real. They're happening on a daily basis. So why else should you be concerned? I mean, not just that these are real and these could happen to you today, but there are these things, there's these people out there called regulators. And they will hold you accountable if, in fact, you haven't done what you're supposed to do under state and federal law. With regard to state regulations involving data breaches, there are actually 47 different data breach notification statutes. And, of course, Washington has one that we'll talk about in a moment. But the data breach notification statutes require notification of consumers regarding breaches of unencrypted personal information. And you should also note that Tennessee just passed this past month an amended statute that doesn't even provide a safe harbor for encrypted personal information. So in that case, even in Tennessee, if it's a breach of encrypted data, you still have to notify consumers. And so just be aware that that may be a trend, because I think the concern by some of those legislators may be that bad guys may get the encryption key, even though there's no evidence of that, and therefore may render the encryption null and void. But bottom line is there are these statutes that require notification of consumers when there's been a breach of data. The obligation is determined by the residential location of the consumer. And that's one of the important points that I want all of you to understand, because I know that you all do business in the state of Washington. But you all have customers, those who ride your buses, that may come from other places. And to the extent that they pay, for instance, with a credit card, and you have their data in your systems, they may actually live in California, or live in Oregon, or Nevada, or Montana, or Tennessee for that matter, and happen to come here because this is a beautiful place to vacation. It's a beautiful place to visit. Your towns are awesome places to be. And so you're going to have people from not just your city or your county or your state. And so as a consequence, your obligations will actually be determined by other data breach notification statutes. And you just need to put that on your radar and understand that. You also have to understand that personal information through these statutes is generally defined as a first name or first initial combined with a last name and one or more of the following data sets: a social security number, a driver's license or state ID card number, or a financial account with the means to access the account. Those are the common data sets in all of the 47 different states that have data breach notification statutes. In addition, the trend is to expand the definition of personal information because of the wide variety of data breaches we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years. And so while all of the data breach notification statutes include as personally identifiable information social security numbers, driver's licenses, and financial accounts, 8 states actually add medical information to that. 5 add online credentials, meaning usernames, email addresses with the means to access the account. And 13 add other information, including healthcare, biometric, and taxpayer ID. So just be aware of the fact that this is an ever-evolving area of regulation, and that the legislators out there are constantly looking to how to better protect their constituents, and the definition of PII appears to be ever expanding. With regard to consumer notification, all the statutes require, 40 require the most expedient time possible. They used words such as expeditiously as possible, as expediently as possible, in the most expedient time possible, or as quickly as possible. 7 have an outer time limit. As an example, the state of Washington requires that it be done as expediently as possible, but no later than 45 days from the discovery of the breach. Also, 36 of the states require a harm threshold, that if you've undertaken the investigation and you believe it's a very low probability of risk, even though the information's been accessed without authorization, there may not be an obligation to notify. But in many of those states, if you make that decision, you actually have to notify the Attorney General that you've arrived at that decision. So that decision itself may receive some extra scrutiny. 19 of the states have specific notice content requirements, such as Washington, we'll cover in a second. And then 25 of those states, if you notify a consumer or a number of consumers, you also have to notify a state regulatory official. As an example, in the state of Oregon, if more than 250 residents have been affected, you also have to notify the Attorney General. In the state of California and Florida, if you notify more than 500 of their residents, you also have to notify the Attorney General. Now, on the other hand, there are some states, if you notify one, you have to notify the Attorney General, such as Montana, Connecticut, New York, Vermont, and a number of other states. If you notify one consumer in any of those states, you also have to notify the Attorney General of that state that, in fact, the data set has been breached. So with regard to Washington, personal information in the state of Washington under the data breach notification statute is defined as a first name or initial and the last name combined with one or more of the following data sets. This is a very traditional data breach notification statute with regard to the definition of PII. The other data sets would be, again, a first initial or first name plus the last name combined with an SSN, a driver's license or state ID card number, and or a financial account with the means to access the account. The notice must be provided in the most expedient time possible, but no more than 45 days from the discovery of the breach. And in Washington, it applies to both electronic and paper data. So say you're burglarized as opposed to hacked. In that burglary, the bad guys took customer records. Maybe they're your ledger sheet of PCI-related data that was just to capture the day before from customers, or maybe it's financial information pertaining to your employees. If it's stolen in paper data, you have an obligation under the data breach notification statute to notify those affected consumers. It requires the notice, and this is where we have the content requirements. It requires the notice to be written in quote-unquote plain language. This is probably a little lesson to attorneys because oftentimes we don't speak in plain language and nobody can understand what in the heck we're trying to say. But the Attorney General for the state of Washington will be scrutinizing all these notices to make sure that consumers actually know what they're supposed to know in the notice. And we're supposed to include contact information for the covered entity, meaning the entity that was breached, a list of affected data sets so that consumers know what data about them was accessed without authorization, and then provide contact information for any credit reporting agencies if sensitive data was affected. To the extent that sensitive data was actually breached, you'll probably get a recommendation from your counsel to provide credit monitoring or identity restoration services, and that should also be in that letter. And then, as I mentioned, if in fact more than 500 Washington residents are affected, you also have to notify the Attorney General. And with that notice, it's essentially a notice to the Attorney General that in fact you have been breached or incurred an information security incident. Typically, you're going to indicate how many residents in the state of Washington were affected. So maybe you've had a breach of 2,500 individuals, 700 of which were in the state of Washington, so you'll put that in the notice, and you'll let the Attorney General know what data sets were affected, and then you'll provide a redacted consumer notification so that you'll have a sample notification that went out to all consumers, and the Attorney General will get a redacted form of that to ensure that, in fact, it complies with the statute. So just be aware that when this happens, the clock starts to tick. You've got to get your ducks in a row very, very quickly. Now, if that didn't concern you, then we've got some federal regulations to be concerned about. Oftentimes, we see enforcement actions from the Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission, Office for Civil Rights, the Security and Exchange Commission, et cetera, based on the Unlawful Trade Practices Act. Through different states, of course, have them, but also in the Federal Communications Act or the Federal Trade Commission Act. They'll have to do with unlawful or deceptive trade practices as alleged by the enforcement agency. And so to the extent that you make representations on your website, for instance, that your data is going to be secure with us, and for whatever reason it's not, they can actually file an enforcement action for misrepresenting the security of your information to the consumer. Similarly, in industry regulations, and this is outside the federal regulations, payment card industry data security standard requires that certain information security frameworks be followed, such as encrypting data in transit and data at rest, making sure your system is segmented, make sure you've got appropriate firewalls in place. And there are a variety of other administrative measures as well that are required to be taken. And to the extent that you're breached and the PCI Data Security Council recognizes that perhaps you weren't following the PCI DSS, then you're going to get assessed. And I've seen some tremendous assessments, meaning tremendous, not good assessments, meaning tremendously high assessments come through in the data payment card breaches this past year. And then if that's not enough to concern you, you may have a wide variety of consumers who just get upset because they're tired of have their data affected by breaches, and they may sue you. And they may file a class action and encourage anybody else that has had their data affected in your breach to join their class action suit. Derivative suits, maybe we don't want to talk about them because you have an awesome board of directors for WISTIP, and I'm sure that they're doing everything they can, but the fact is oftentimes suits follow because of that as well. So another thing is, if you're not concerned about the fact that the threat is real, because there are some serious regulatory enforcement actions taking place out there, then let's talk about finances. And perhaps right now I'm talking to maybe the CFOs or the folks responsible for financial management of the member agencies. And some would say, well, I'm not really that worried about it. Well, let's talk about cost. And I'd like to break it down in maybe 4 different buckets. And each of these buckets, they make sense to me in part because they also are insurable buckets. And so I want to make sure that regardless of what it might cost here, and you should be concerned about that, should you have a breach, make sure you reach out to WISTIP immediately to talk about whether or not your incident is covered by cyber liability insurance. But one of the first costs would be first-party costs, and those are the costs that directly impact your transit agency, meaning your data loss, software loss, hardware loss. Say you're hit by an encryption attack, and you've got to wipe off literally the data. Maybe your backups were corrupted, and you've lost some intellectual property. What's that worth to you? What was the time and money that went in to develop that stuff? And one of the things I should mention about those encryption attacks is what we have seen as a trend is that the couple of the most recent encryption attacks I've worked on, the bad guys actually were targeted a business, and they went in ahead of time and actually corrupted their backups. So when it came time to initiate the encryption attack, they had substantially more leverage because the information security personnel who thought their backups had integrity went back and realized in one situation they'd lost 2 days of data, and another situation lost 2 weeks of data, even though everything was automated. The bad guys had figured out how to reconfigure some tables in their backup systems, and unfortunately were corrupted. So what happened is in those situations, the companies then had to determine whether or not it was worth paying the Bitcoin in order to get all that data back, because they were never going to recover it since their backups were corrupted. So be aware that that's a trend. The bad guys have recognized that they can make a lot of money with encryption attacks, and so to the extent that they corrupt backups, they simply give themselves far more leverage. So that's going to be a direct loss. Income loss. Say you get hit with a DDoS attack and your servers are taken offline. You can't communicate. You can't provide a service. What happens? Say if you're interconnected, and your buses are interconnected, and maybe you've got the Internet of Things starting to affect the way we do business, and all of a sudden digitally we're shut down. What happens if you can't provide that service? How much income do you lose on an hourly basis or daily basis? What's it cost to restore those services? All that stuff is a first-party cost, and sometimes that could be substantial, even on just a daily basis. And then we have the third-party costs, and my primary concern here are consumers. If consumers are upset, they don't feel like they've been treated fairly, meaning they thought their information was more secure than it was, or you haven't remediated properly in terms of the notice you've provided them or credit monitoring, they may sue you, and that can get very expensive very quickly as well, which is why I would want you to focus on your remediation costs. What I found is that the more effectively you remediate to both your system, making sure your information security personnel have what they need to not only impose a robust information security framework, but also to make sure they're able to respond to incidents. And then also, the more effective you remediate to consumers, meaning provide them notification, provide them self-help remedies. If sensitive data is lost, provide them credit monitoring and identity restoration services. The better and more quickly and effective you do that, the less likelihood you'll face any third-party costs. So I find that the more effective you remediate, both to your information system and to your consumers, the less liability you have anyplace else. And similarly, with fines and penalties. Those are the results of perhaps regulatory investigations, PCI DSS fines and penalties, that kind of stuff. But again, to the extent that you actually provide your information security personnel with the resources they need to do their job and provide a robust information security framework to protect your information, and you as the human provide an extra firewall to that system, and then if something does happen, you actually effectively respond because you've got an instant response plan in place, and you're able to provide credit monitoring very, very quickly, or notification to provide self-help remedies quickly, then typically the regulators are satisfied with that response and your preparation for that response, and I've seen them provide favorable treatment to you. So, but again, should anything happen, make sure you reach out to WISTIP immediately to see whether or not you've got cyber liability insurance coverage, because some of the stuff can get very expensive very quickly. So, say that doesn't bother you. That doesn't bother you. You know, you don't have responsibility for information security. You don't have responsibility for financial management. You know, it's not your responsibility to deal with the regulators. So, how would it affect other employees if their sensitive information was disclosed without their authorization? And how would it affect them if you mistakenly disclosed their sensitive information? Put yourself in the seat of somebody being approached via email by someone you think is your superior, requesting some sensitive information within the scope of your employment, and you're, for whatever reason, it's not your superior, but you nonetheless provide that sensitive information, and it goes out the back door to the dark web. How is that going to make you feel? How is that going to cause you to be perceived within your agency? So how would you feel, though, if your sensitive information was disclosed without your authorization? It's probably a good reflection of how it's going to feel for others if you're the one that's disclosed it. And just think again, what if you're the one that's sitting in the desk and you look at the computer monitor and you get that email message and you respond to it and you zip up the W-2s and it goes out the back door? How are you going to feel? Not good. So, what can you do? Well, one of the things I like to remind people is security is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You just take one step at a time. But the reality is you got to keep moving forward. If you don't move forward, inevitably, with regard to our digital environment, you're going to be moving backward. And so you've got to kind of butt that tide and keep moving forward and lean forward and do everything you can to work with your information security professionals to, when they make a request of you, like to change your password every 90 days, just smile and say, thanks for reminding me. I'm going to do it now. That's something you can do on a daily basis. Somebody else might have other responsibility, but there are things you can do. Now, generally, with regard to your agency, obviously the agency itself can develop an information security program with administrative measures, and those are your policies and procedures and technical measures. You've got some great information security personnel who are working more than full-time to make sure technologically your system has what it needs. But then there are physical measures. Say somebody says you got to wear a guest tag when you walk in the door so people know that you're authorized to be in a place. Well, say thanks. I appreciate you helping me keep my place more secure. It may be you've got a key card that you're issued, and you want to make sure that stays with you. You don't give it to other people. But there are a variety of physical measures. Maybe locking the door behind you. Maybe shutting off your computer. And there'll be some other technical measures that go along with that as well. But there'll be physical measures that also are all part of an information security program, and your agency should have each of those three areas covered. But be aware of your digital environment and be aware of your physical environment. One of the things I think of when I'm thinking about being aware of my digital environment is I remind myself when I used to train in martial arts. And one session I'll never forget my sensei talking about is really being aware of our physical environment, wherever we are, whether we are in a dojo, whether we are sparring, or whether we are walking out the back door of a business late at night. And he created a habit with me where I always look under my car to make sure that nobody's there to slice my Achilles. I mean, it sounds stupid. I don't want to make you think I'm a paranoid dude. But the reality is it causes me to think that no matter where you are, there may be some danger lurking around the corner. And you don't want to be paranoid, but you want to be aware of it. And to the extent that you're aware of it and keep your eyes and your ears open, oftentimes you can prevent it. And similarly, in your digital environment, everybody communicates digitally via email or text or Snapchat or other means. But you get to control who you communicate with and how you communicate and what you respond to. And you've got to be ever more aware of what type of digital information you're receiving and what type of digital information you're responding with. And another big message here is data security is not just an IT issue, okay? It's everybody's business. Guarding against unauthorized access is everyone's responsibility, but it does start at the top. So this is a message for the managers of the WSTIP member agencies. And one of the questions I've got to ask you is, are you providing the appropriate support to your information technology programs and personnel? Okay. I encourage you to think about that. I know you've got regular budget reviews and analyses and dates and deadlines, but as part of that, I really encourage you to engage in a conversation with your information technology personnel to get a feel for what they perceive they need. Not just what they need, but perhaps sometimes what they want. Sometimes what they want is actually what they need. But have that conversation so you're able to identify that and make sure that your system is as protected technically as it possibly can. And again, a reminder, not just an IT issue. Employees, you are on the front lines of the data security struggle. You are the human firewall. And as the people literally, whether the front end of your office, you may approve and process payments. You may maintain sensitive information. You may communicate on behalf of an organization or behalf of certain parts of your agency. And you literally, as a result of that, you may hold the keys to the kingdom that are sought by the cyber thieves. So even if your agency's built a strong technical defense, hackers can still exploit weak human security. And they do that every single day to gain access to the agency's systems and data. So first and foremost, when you log on, just always think about protecting sensitive data. Whether it's your name and ID and other things about you or someone else's, it's really critical today and moving forward that we really do everything we can to protect sensitive data. And again, just the PII, the personally identifiable information that's regulated by the data breach notification statutes, or maybe payment card industry data, or maybe protected health information. And by that I mean, even though, of course, we're not healthcare providers, periodically, if you're in human resources, for instance, you may actually process personally identifiable health information. which may, in some contexts, be protected. But be very, very careful about that. And then to the extent that you're responsible for keeping the financials or proprietary information with your agency confidential, take responsibility for that and make sure that happens. Now, as part of that, we should all know kind of where is our data kept. And oftentimes this is maybe unique to the domain of the information security professionals, but if you're managing an agency or you're responsible for certain types of information, you should know where that information is kept, how it's kept, and how it's secured. Is it on servers on site, or is it on a data center somewhere? Is it in the cloud? And if so, do you have the ability to protect it? Is it on mobile devices, portable media? What about vendors? Or is it in paper records? And if it's in paper records, are you locking up the cabinet each night when you leave the office? Because the bad guys, all they need to do is kick in a door or break a window. And I've seen some pretty sophisticated diamond cutters out there that will actually cut through a beautiful etched glass window or an etched glass door and come in the middle of the night. And if a file cabinet's not locked, all they have to do is dig in, put your files containing customer information in a box, walk out, put it in their trunk, head back to their hotel room, and start mining that data at 2:30 in the morning while they're enjoying their meth. So be aware that that's what happens. So it's critical that if it's in digital form, to keep it encrypted if at all possible. Now that's not the panacea, because if a bad guy gets access to user credentials and may otherwise have access to the key, he or she can decrypt it. But the key is typically under the data breach notification statutes, if your data is actually encrypted in transit and at rest, it's going to fall into a safe harbor. So if a bad guy gets it, the presumption is that they're not going to be able to access it because it's going to be unreadable to them. It's going to be a jarbled mesh of digital information because of the encryption. But you need to think about who has access to the information. And if you're responsible for controlling that access, make sure it's only accessible to people who need it for their occupational responsibilities. All sensitive data should only be accessed on a need-to-know basis. If you don't need to access it, you shouldn't have access to it, and you really don't want access to it. It just causes problems. And another conversation you should be having with your employees if you're a manager, or if you're an employee responsible for certain data, do you have a data retention policy? And one of the reasons for that is you should only have data as long as you need it for legitimate occupational purposes. One of the worst things you'll want is have a data breach and have thousands of data sets there that you didn't need. That just expands your legal liability and some tremendous costs when, in fact, if you had a data retention policy and when you no longer needed that information for occupational purposes, you destroyed it, you'd no longer be liable for it. So I would strongly encourage you to think about that too. If you're responsible for any sensitive data, make sure you've got a data retention policy, and at some point when you no longer need that information for your legitimate needs, then that information should be destroyed. One of the things that we all get frustrated about, I know, is passwords. And when I get my reminder, I need to change my password, I'm thinking, are you serious? How could 90 days have just gone by? It was only 7 days ago. It seems as though I changed it. But I do know that password management is critical to the security of your data. I also know that it should always be at least 12 characters or more, and anything less than that, quite frankly, isn't as secure as it should be. Anything more than that becomes exponentially more secure with every digit. It should also change every 90 days. And by the way, there's a thing out there called the Dirty Dozen, created by some of your information security personnel, and some of these are part of that. The Dirty Dozen really are 12 quick wins in information security that everybody should be participating in across all your platforms. You should also have systems in place where unsuccessful attempts would lock out an account. And what that prevents is that a bad guy who's trying to guess at your password, if you have 2 or 3 unsuccessful attempts, then it locks the account down. And that allows your information security personnel to flag that account as perhaps being attempted without authorization, or access was attempted without authorization, so you know that something's amiss. You should also make sure that your system or browser doesn't remember passwords, that you've got to manually enter them each time. And you should never share your password with anybody else. So good password management is one of the keys, and again, it's part of you being the human firewall. It all depends on how you manage it, combined with some technical efficiencies that your information security personnel will provide you, but it's really critical that you manage your passwords well, and that when your information technology partners say, hey, it's time to change, just smile, grin and bear it, and thank them for helping to secure the information. To the extent that you're allowed to use a mobile device on your network, a smartphone, and that's you all have different policies about that. Really be cautious about how you're utilizing that. And I would encourage you to only allow remote access to your networks if you're using dual-factor authentication, not just a user and a password, because any bad guy might be able to get that, and with that they've got access to your network from anywhere in the world. And so to the extent you're able to access your network, perhaps via a smartphone or laptop, make sure you have dual-factor authentication so that it's not just something you know, meaning a username and a password that a bad guy might know as well, but it's something like a remotely generated code in your hand that you have, that if you're in the United States and the bad guy's in the Ukraine, only you're the one that's going to have that. And using that second factor of authentication will allow you, the actual person who is supposed to have authorized access, to get into the system when it won't allow a bad guy. To the extent that you walk away from your computer, you should have systems in place where your screen will lock if it's not intended, if it's not attended, if you're not active on the computer for a certain period of time, whether it's perhaps 2 minutes or more. And a password's required to reactivate. So simply not just hitting your mouse, but actually entering a password will reactivate that. Make sure that if you're going to store information on flash drives or other devices, that you encrypt that data. Some of the largest breaches I've dealt with were breaches where flash drives were lost. I had one where over 50,000 W2 images was stored on a tiny little flash drive. And that's why that can be so dangerous, because we can store so much data in such small places now. And oftentimes, because it's so small, they can be easily lost. You saw that one of the transit agencies on the first slide was a victim of a data breach because a flash drive was lost. It's just that easy, just that quick. And with that, you can have literally thousands of sensitive data sets that you're responsible for, and it can become very expensive very quickly. And if you have to surf the web, if you just can't resist looking at your Facebook account or your LinkedIn account or that beautiful new YouTube video or your favorite actor or celebrity, just do it very, very cautiously. And if you're going to download anything from the internet, make sure you do things very safely and according to all the policies and procedures set forth by your information technology professionals. Now, with regard to your physical environment, again, I think many of you thought, well, we're going to talk about digital data, but really your physical environment is absolutely critical here. Make sure that if you've got sensitive documents in paper form, make sure they're locked up in a file cabinet. Dispose of them appropriately, meaning make sure they're not just thrown away, make sure they're shredded. Years ago, when I was a federal prosecutor, some of my first big identity theft cases were because tax preparers, for instance, thought they were being environmentally conscientious by recycling their return information. Unfortunately, they weren't shredded. And so we had bad guys getting a hold of tax return information of thousands of citizens, and they had their names, their dates of birth, their social security numbers, and they went to work immediately to access their credit. So make sure that anything that contains sensitive information is shredded properly so the bad guys can't get access to it once it's recycled. Never share your access key or your fob, and always question unescorted strangers. You know, in the past, we may have thought that, well, it's rude if I ask somebody who they are or what they're doing here. Well, there are polite ways to do that. And I think now in our environment where we're trying to keep our information secure, and there's good reason for that, people will appreciate the fact that they're being asked, if they need any assistance, and if they're looking for someone, if you can help guide them to where they're destined. And I think they would actually appreciate that. But there are some ways in which you can do that in a very professional, polite, respectful manner that will otherwise keep your place secure. And if there's something that appears to be out of place, it probably is. If that appears to be suspicious, it probably is. So if you see something, say something. I know it sounds kind of cheesy sometimes, but the reality is if you see something suspicious, it is. And say something about it to somebody. just a quick note about security policies. You should all have them. Um, security policies for your physical environment, your administratively and technically. And if you don't, we can assist you with that. But you should have security policies governing all your critical security controls on your technical system, which also governs your administrative and physical security. But if you're not aware of whether you have them or not and how they apply to you, ask your information technology folks about whether or not you've got those policies and what you're supposed to do about them and how they might apply to you and how you can help the process by making sure they're properly applied and enforced. And then another thing, though, is make sure that within your agency you know what to do if you detect a security violation. Say something happens on your own computer. What do? Who do you call immediately? Just make sure internally you know that. So if you see something, you know actually who to tell about that problem, and whether it's something on your computer or something physically in your environment. How do you deal with it quickly? So I'm going to talk a bit in some detail now about social engineering. We talked about that at the outset with regard to encryption attacks and fraudulent money transfer attacks. But we're going to talk more about kind of how it happens and what you can do to prevent it. But it's a process by which these are able to manipulate otherwise responsible people into divulging sensitive information. And I see it as really the art of human hacking. And it's not just new employees who are unfamiliar systems. Oftentimes the bad guys are attacking executives and managers. The bottom line is all employees are vulnerable, but to the extent you have any public profile, you're going to be a target, and the bad guys are going to seek you out. Phishing emails, historically we saw some goofy stuff years ago where somebody would appear to have sent you a message from your bank when in fact you'd never even heard of the bank, or you certainly never banked there, so you knew it was just a spam email. Well, now the bad guys have refined their approaches, and oftentimes if it is really just a phishing email, it's going to be something that you're likely to click on, something you might be interested in. But spear phishing is what we're seeing on a daily basis, where bad guys will actually identify you as someone that they're going to target. They will actually do some reconnaissance, see if you have a Facebook account, and if they can see it, they'll get a feel for what you're interested in. Or they'll look at your LinkedIn account and get a feel for where you went to school, what your associations might belong to, perhaps who you might be linked with. And from that, they'll get a feel for the type of message they could send to you to cause you to open up. For instance, I did what we call a tabletop exercise the other day for a large financial institution. And I wanted to make sure that I could successfully exploit somebody with social engineering. And so I wanted to make sure I identified somebody in their accounting department. And all I did was literally Google a little bit about that financial institution, a bit about their accounting department, and found a bright young man who went to a certain school, did certain things while he was in college, belonged to certain professional associations, and crafted an email that I knew he would open up. And sure enough, it happened. But it was just an example of how much of our information is available to us on social networking sites. And the bad guys have that access too. It's not just access to us, but the bad guys will use it for their purposes. They'll get a feel for what your interests are. They'll craft a message that they think you're going to open up, and when you do, kabam, it encrypts your network. Or perhaps you think that they're there's somebody that you'd otherwise trust. We've also seen what has come to be known business email compromise. In the past, some people would call it the man-in-the-middle attack, or it's a CEO fraud. But hackers are now impersonating individuals, causing wire transfers to leave agencies. So you're not immune to this. Oftentimes, it appears as though it's somebody responsible for wire transfers, and if that's you and your agency, know that you're going to be targeted at some point if you haven't already. And somebody that you think would typically request you to wire transfer a certain amount of money to a client account number, you're going to get a message from that person. And from here on out, I encourage you to take some steps I'm going to discuss in a following slide or two, where don't simply respond like you may have historically and actually wire transfer the information, because from here on out, you probably want to put on a flag that this is probably from a fraudster. It's not from your fellow employee directing you to legitimately transfer money outside the agency. We have seen millions of dollars on a weekly basis leave certain enterprises because of this fraudulent money exploit. So ransomware, we already talked a lot about that. It can come with other malware. But typically, ransomware is simply will encrypt data, and then you'll get the request for the ransom. Be aware, though, that you're probably going to have to do some forensics work because we never know what artifacts of malware are left behind. And because of the exploits we're seeing recently where they actually go in and corrupt backups first, we know they've been in your system. And so to the extent they're in your system doing something else, they may be in your system actually harvesting credentials as well. Even though we know that there is honor among thieves with regard to ransomware, and so we know that if you pay them the ransom, they have to get back their system, otherwise that business model is going to fail. The reality is, if they've got malware in your system, that malware attack associated with it may be attenuated enough from the ransomware that you won't put two and two together, meaning the bad guys may install what we call a Trojan or a backdoor in your network while they're hitting you with the ransomware attack. But they may not hit you with the other attack for 6 months. So you don't know that it's actually coming in as part of a ransomware, or the ransomware, you don't know that it's really the decoy for what they might otherwise be doing to your system. So just be aware that the bad guys are evolving. The malware is evolving to bad guys, though, in terms of their actual individual focused actions are getting more dangerous every day. Social engineering attacks. We've seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks especially tremendous success by the bad guys of social engineering senior executives, management personnel, folks in human resources and accounting specifically, and exfiltrating literally millions of W-2 images from employees around the country. And as I mentioned, fraudulent money transfers are huge in terms of the impact they're having on businesses. But to the extent that you're responsible for any wire transfers within your agency, first of all, make sure the request is authorized. Double check the email addresses. Make sure that within your agency you've got multi-person approval processes, I would say, for all wire transfer transactions. But some agencies will want to establish a monetary threshold if you've got multiple wire transfers per day. But make sure you're mapping your expense to a valid purchase order and that you obtain managerial approval, not just via email, but either by telephone, so you're initiating the call to somebody you know and you recognize their voice, or you're walking down the hall and physically making sure it's approved by another person. But slow down, be suspicious if anybody in your agency says, by the way, time's of the essence, and by the way, it's a sensitive matter, don't tell anybody else about it. If anybody in your agency requests you to be secretive or somehow keep wire transfer confidential, that should be a red flag that it's some sort of scam, and you want to make sure that you personally verify that with the employee or your superior that asked you to do it, and what you'll probably find it is, in fact, a scam. These have been estimated to cause businesses multiple billions of dollars in recent years. We've seen some, as we see on the slide here, that have truly been multiple billions to a couple big companies, but I've seen them 5-figure, 6-figure losses on a regular basis, and it all adds up. So with regard to emails, just be ever aware that the bad guys are trying to exploit you. And I encourage you, if for some reason you're not expecting an email from someone, to look at it. Look at the email. I don't expect you to look at headers, but look at the email address itself. If it's coming from a .org versus a .com, that will maybe a flag. If it's coming from a .ru, for instance, or a different country, that should be a red flag. But if you've got generically worded emails purporting to be from person with titles or other entities requesting disclosure of any sensitive information, that should be a big red flag, and you want to delete that or forward it to your help desk. If you've got it from anybody requesting a transfer of funds, and if you're responsible for the funds, that might be normal in the course of your business. But if it's anybody that you're not used to or speaking with generic language in an email, make sure you forward that to your help desk and flag it. I would always encourage you, if somebody's actually requesting sensitive information or a transfer of funds, even if you haven't done it in the past, now do it, confirm face-to-face or via telephone that in fact the information is actually required or payment is truly requested. And it's just literally a matter of walking down the hall or picking up the telephone. And I know I have kind of forgotten about my telephone. I seldom use it anymore. I respond to over 200 substantive emails a day, and I seldom use my landline. But if I were in your position, what I would do, anytime I got an email requesting sensitive information, I would reach for my phone, pick it up, call the person requesting to see if it was actually them. Or if I was responsible for wire transfers, I would pick up my phone, call the person who appeared to be requesting it, and confirm that, in fact, they did. If you're not doing that, you're probably going to find yourself disclosing sensitive information to somebody on the dark web or paying somebody in Southeast Asia or Nigeria, and your agency is not going to be real pleased with you. If you have any unusual requests, now more than ever before, it's time to just ask. Let somebody know. Your superiors will appreciate the fact that you're taking a few extra minutes to be more cautious and diligent to make sure that the information being disclosed is in fact that which should be disclosed. But don't open email from unknown sources. Don't open suspicious or unsolicited emails. It's okay to delete. I know years ago I used to feel guilty if I didn't respond, and then I realized, it's bad guys are going to get access to my network if if I fall victim to my guilt. And so if I have emails from unknown sources, I typically don't respond, and oftentimes I will forward them to my help desk. Especially if it's suspicious and has any sort of link or language that doesn't appear to be appropriate. Never reply to emails asking you to reveal your credentials. And note that financial institutions, government agencies won't ask for that stuff. And so if you see that, you know that somebody's fishing for something. And make sure that links and documents and emails are legitimate before opening. You should confirm that, in fact, it's sent from the person that was sent before you click on a link, because oftentimes those links will go to, will download what we call an executable piece of malicious code that will then start to infect your system. And oftentimes you can hover your cursor over a link and it will reveal the associated URL or the email address to determine actually whether it comes from the place that you think it does. And if you're not sure, ask. Don't be pushed or intimidated by anybody who says time's of the essence or I need this now. Take a deep breath, stop, and think before you click. And if you have any questions whatsoever, pick up the phone and call the person that appears to be requesting the information, or get out of your chair and walk down the hallway and make sure you have a personal confirmation that the request was legitimate. Only you can prevent social engineering. You truly are the human firewall when it comes to information security. Your awareness of common social engineering techniques is absolutely critical in spotting the difference between legitimate requests by customers, coworkers, and superiors, and attempts by thugs, literally they're just thugs, to gain unauthorized access to your agency's data, resources, or money. And regardless of the technical information security controls in place, and I know you've got some awesome information technology professionals working with your agencies, but regardless of how hard they're working on a daily basis, social engineering attacks can cause catastrophic consequences to your information system. So it's ever more critical to think before you click. And don't forget about that old standby, the phone, the thing that sometimes we've forgotten about, sometimes the thing that collects dust over in the corner of your desk. When in doubt, call someone.
I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and that this was the WISTIP Radio Network. And we'll be signing off. If you have any questions, please give us a call or send us an email. And by the way, Sean would be happy to come out and train at your agency. So if you have any questions about how he might be able to do that, give me a call.